Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam shri radhika prana natha padasaro yena premanubhutyasha dattam tam shri gurum bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasutsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Kotha Mahamrita Payura Shomuda Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudabam Murdnani Patyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kado Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhaktamaj Jai Rachilo Chaitanya-charita Gaura Govinda Lila Tahate Ashunite Galai Shila Tahate Na Hoilu Morachita Jeva Nahi Buji Keva Shunite Siha Kiad Bhuta Chaitanya-charit Krishna Upajive Priti Janibera Serariti Shunile Borohoihit Shriyatam Nityam Giyatam Mura Chintyatam Bhaktash Chaitanya-charitamrita. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Prema Purushottam, Karuna, Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, Shri Krishnadas Kaviraja Gosvami, nourished by Shri Rup, Shri Sanatan, Shri Raghunath, and thus a most graceful songbird in the inexhaustible sky of Gaura Lila. Again, today we will resume our discussion of Sri Chaitanya-charitamrita in the Sanatana Shiksha Madhya Lila, chapter 22, the Abhidheya, and today starting discussion of Sharanagati here in the Charitamrita. So, for the last few weeks, we've had a discussion of the Prakaran on Sharanagati and Hari Bhakti Vilas as a prelude to this discussion. So returning now here to the Sanatan Shiksha, having seen how Sanatan Pad ultimately later wrote on Sharanagati there, we'll look at how Sriman Mahaprabhu's teaching of Sharanagati is presented here to Sanatan, and we see that a number of the same verses are cited, and we'll look at some of the points that Sanatana Gosvami made there in Hari Bhakti Vilas, as well as points made by other commentators on these verses to understand their import more broadly. And for reference, this discussion now comes after the discussion of Asat Sangha, and prior to that the discussion of Sat Sangha. So having explained how bhakti is the abhideya, having explained that the eligibility for bhakti is shraddha, and then explained that the cause of the acquisition of that eligibility and ultimately of bhakti itself is sadhu sangha, that sadhu sangha is the most supportive thing for the manifestation of bhakti within the heart, and as a corollary how asat sangha is highly detrimental and to be avoided. All these points have been made up to now in the chapter. So now we come to discussion of Sharanagati, which, as we discussed earlier, with reference to Jiva Gosvami Pad, where he says that Sharanagati is the linga, or the indicator of Shraddha. As is the extent of our Shraddha, so shall be the extent of our Sharanagati. So that extent can be measured, if you will, to the extent that the limbs of Sharanagati that will be described ahead and that were described at the end of the prakaran on Sharanagati that we discussed are evident within our speech, our thoughts, and our deeds. So here we'll look at how Mahaprabhu introduces and explains this concept of Sharanagati, and then the remainder of the chapter will go to the practice of sadhana bhakti, or how a Sharanagata will go about engaging in bhakti. So, having said that, we will now jump in. So again, the file is available in the folder. So this is picking up from Payar 93 here, Madhya 22. Having thus recited 5 verses in regard to the Vaishnava conduct of abandoning asatsanga, Srimad Mahaprabhu next discusses the subject of Sharanagati, that is, taking shelter in Bhagavan Sri Krishna, over the course of the ensuing 11 verses. In regard to the following payar, the tippani states the following, quote, most confidential, even more so than that is, than abandoning asatsanga, as was just enjoined, he states another conduct of theirs, meaning of Vaishnavas. He speaks this verse. So, as we'll see, the abandonment of asatsanga can be considered a limb of Sharanagati, one of them being pratikulyasya varjanam, rejection of the unfavorable. So, the asatsanga is undoubtedly unfavorable, so hereby describing or prefacing the discussion of Sharanagati as something, quote, more confidential, we can take it to mean something that goes further to the essence of what is to be grasped, of what is to be imbibed. Simply negating something unfavorable doesn't necessarily equate with attainment of what is to be sought or to be had. But Sharanagati in itself is of the essence in that integral to it is both the avoidance of what is not of the essence and the resolve to engage in what is of the essence and to connect with or to dedicate to the principal object of attainment. So we can take the Tippani's explanation in that way. So here we go with Payar 93. Etasab charyar varnashrama dharma akinchana hoyalaya krishnayika sharana. Leaving them all, meaning all types of asatsanga, as were discussed in the previous verses, as well as varnashram dharma, which was negated in the discussion of Shraddha earlier in the chapter, and, quote, being divested, take shelter solely in Krishna. So, the injunction here, the vidhi is loya, to take Krishnaika Sharana, or Krishna Sharana, Krishna Ak Sharana. So to take or to accept as one's shelter Sharana, Krishna alone, or solely Krishna. And moreover, to do so, akinchana hoya, being divested. So the remainder of the prakaran will discuss what it is or how this Krishna Sharana, or this acceptance of Krishna as Sharan, as shelter, is to be done. So what is, you could say, most specifically brought out in this particular payar is this mention of being akinchana. So we'll look at that here in the commentary. The reasons for the instruction Srimad Mahaprabhu gives here to leave asatsanga have been discussed over the last 6 verses. The reasons for the instruction he gives here to leave varnashram dharma, that is, to let go of the notion that the duties of one's varna and ashram are paramount and invariably incumbent upon one, was also discussed earlier in verses 56 to 63 of this chapter. The quality of being, quote, divested, akinchana, or being synonymous meaning niskinchana, literally refers to being, quote, without anything, akinchana. So in Sanskrit, the indefinite pronoun is kim, and when you apply this pratyaya chana, then the ma turns into a nya, so you get kin chana. So from what, you get basically something like what some, meaning a thing or something, we say in English. So then when you put a negative particle on that, kinchana, you get no thing or without anything. So literally, this word akinchana simply means to be without something or without anything. So what is the import, or what is intended by speaking of someone as being, quote, without anything? When the term akinchana is being used as an adjective of bhakti, as in the case of Srimad Bhagavatam 5:18-12 cited earlier in verse 74 of this chapter, its sense is, quote, unconditional, meaning it is, quote, without anything in the way of conditions, selfish interests, desires for other objects, and so on. So, yasyasti bhagavato yasya kinchana, this verse spoken by Prahlad Maharaj, which we came earlier in the chapter. In that context, the word akinchana was an adjective or a modifier of the word bhakti. So this bhakti was, quote, without anything. So what to say that bhakti is without anything was taken, according to the commentaries, as being unconditional. It didn't have any other motivation for it. It didn't have any other interest within it. It didn't have any condition upon it. It was just bhakti for Bhagavan without anything else. And, okay, I see the note. 1 sec. Sorry, did I forget to upload the file? Perhaps so. Just a sec. Okay, should be there now. Sorry about that. I thought it was already uploaded last week. Maybe it didn't go up in the midst of my internet failures last week. Anyway, you can have a look now. So, within the list of 28 qualities of a Vaishnava enumerated earlier in verses 78 to 80 of this chapter, Sriman Mahaprabhu also used the term akinchana to refer to one such quality. So in other words, if we're looking at this and we're reading this carefully, and we're seeing that Mahaprabhu quoted the Bhagavatam, speaking about akinchana bhakti, and then a little bit later, he spoke about the qualities of a Vaishnava, and he also said that a Vaishnava is akinchana, that this is also a quality of a Vaishnava. He also mentioned that another quality was Krishnaika Sharana, another point that's made here in this payar, that their soul shelter is Krishna. So, when he used the word, or he referred to a verse that uses the word akinchana as a modifier of bhakti, and then elsewhere as a quality of a Vaishnava, then the meaning was slightly different in that second context. So in that context, the term akinchana was explained to mean, quote, non-possessing, or aparigraha. Literally, that is, being without anything, by all the commentators in their explanations of the mention of akinchana by Bhagavan Sri Krishna in corresponding verses from Srimad Bhagavatam. So we showed how this stack of qualities that Mahaprabhu mentions in those three payars mirror precisely, minus one quality, the list of qualities mentioned by Krishna in the 11th canto to Uddhava. So we can derive the meaning of those qualities listed in these three payars from the commentaries on those verses of Bhagavatam. And when we already did this, then we saw that akinchana was glossed as, quote, non-possessing. So not holding possessions or accumulating possessions. In another statement from Srimad Bhagavatam 7.532, cited earlier in this chapter, to evidence the importance of receiving the grace of a mahat, it was seen that the term nishkinchana was used to describe a mahat and explained to mean, and then we had a few different meanings given there. So why we're doing all this analysis is to say, what does Mahaprabhu mean here when he's telling us to, quote, be akinchana? So this is how we can try to understand this. First of all, we can see how has he used this word earlier, what did he mean then? We can consider perhaps that's applicable here. So in the case of a mahat, when a mahat was also said to be nishkinchan or akinchan, then we see a few different interpretations of that given, which are as follows. Number one who has relinquished all possession or acquisition of worldly objects out of love for Bhagavan. So the qualifier of out of love is specific to the bhakti path, because the word akinchana or akinchana can also describe a renunciate in general. So simply not having possessions doesn't necessarily make you a Vaishnava. But if one gives up one's possessions out of love for Bhagavan or for the sake of further dedicating oneself to Bhagavan's service, then that could be considered a quality of a Vaishnava, or a quality of a Mahat, a great Vaishnava. Alternately, one who is indifferent towards everything by virtue of their regard only for Bhagavad Bhakti. So another interpretation, to be, quote, without anything isn't in the literal sense of physical objects or possessions, but rather indifference towards everything, meaning the circumstances of the world or the circumstances of one's present life or the way one is treated or things like this. In other words, one is concerned only with bhakti for Bhagavan, and one's behavior, one's pursuits are all related to that. One has no other consideration. 3, one who has relinquished desire for conventional wealth, sons and wife, karma and gyan by virtue of conviction in the statement of Bhagavan in the Bhagavad 3.22, they who have given up karmas and given up relatives and friends for me are sadhus. So in other words, it can also be taken in the sense of a path as well as in a sense of relationships. To be, quote, without anything can mean to not hold on to relationships which don't serve progress on the path of bhakti, as well as other modalities of life or even scripturally enjoined practices which are not conducive to adherence to the path of bhakti. So as we discussed, once one acquires Shraddha in bhakti, one loses one's adhikar for karma. And to have Shraddha in bhakti is distinct from having Shraddha in Gyan, although those who follow the path of Gyan may also integrate practices of bhakti into their path. All these things were discussed earlier in the chapter. And a fourth meaning, one who has cast away self-conceit based on objects of the senses. Or lastly, to be, quote, without anything can be taken more in at a psychological level to say that one has no attachment, one invests no sense of identity, fosters no conceit based on whatever possessions one has or doesn't have or what have you. So, in other words, it can be taken literally, it can also be taken non-literally. In regard to other descriptions of a mahat, sadhu or bhakta, being akinchana or nishkinchana, elsewhere in Srimad Bhagavatam. So those were all interpretations given with reference to 7.532, which was cited earlier in the chapter. If we look at the way our acaryas have discussed this word in other places in the Bhagavatam, similar explanations are frequently offered, as well as additional ones, such as, quote, one who is desireless even of moksha, one for whom there is no object worthy of being accepted, alternately admired, other than Bhagavan, and one for whom, that is, in the view of whom, there is, quote, nothing at all, that is, no mundane object whatsoever, and rather only one supreme all-encompassing object, that the essential nature of which is complete consciousness and bliss, namely Bhagavan. So, to be, quote, without anything is just to say, there is Bhagavan and nothing else. So it wouldn't, even in that sense, be a literally negation of nothing, like a nihilistic viewpoint, but without anything, meaning without anything other than Bhagavan. So to see the world as a manifestation of Bhagavan's energy, to see all the features that line the spiritual path, as you will, as manifestations of Bhagavan or of his grace. In that way, to see that there's one all-encompassing object outside of which nothing exists. So many different ways this can be applied. Given that this instruction to thus be, quote, divested, or akinchana, in the pyre under discussion, is being given by Sriman Mahaprabhu, along with an instruction to take shelter solely in Krishna, it is likely that the intended import of the mention of being divested in this case is equivalent to the second of the two categories of persons said to take shelter in Sri Bhagavan, that Sri Jivapad discusses as he treats the topic of Sharanagati in Bhakti Sandarbha. So, all these different interpretations are there of what it means to be a kinchana. More or less, you could apply any of them and all of them in this case. But while they're all there and on the table, if you will, we also see that when Jiva Gosvami takes up the topic of Sharanagati, he also makes a specific categorization related to this idea of being a kinchana. And surprise, surprise, when this prakaran on Sharanagati begins, the first thing that's said is related to being a kinchana and engaging in Sharanagati. So there's a tight parallel, if you will, between the way the thought is unfolding in the Bhakti Sandarbha and the way things are being presented here in the Charitamrita. So that we'll also consider. So he says, quote, those whose sole desire is bhakti, bhakti matra kama, since to desire bhakti alone entails one be, quote, divested, akinchana, in regard to all else. So this is a passage from the Bhakti Sandarbha. Shadvargadyari kritasangsara bhaya bhadyamana eva hi sharanam pravishati ananya gati bhakti matra kamopi tat krita bhagavad vaimukya bhadyamanaha. So he says, being troubled by the fear or the suffering of samsara, caused by the enemies beginning with the Shadvarga, or the, quote, group of 6, namely desire, anger, greed, delusion, conceit, and envy, one who is devoid of any other recourse, or, quote, ananya gati, one who feels oneself to have no shelter from such trouble, enters shelter, that is, take shelter in Bhagavan, as also does one whose sole desire is bhakti, being troubled by the obliviousness of Bhagavan caused by them, that is, by the aforementioned enemies, meaning one whose sole desire is bhakti takes shelter in Bhagavan for the sake of becoming free from the impediments to apt enactment of bhakti created by the Shadvarga, so that one can remain ever absorbed in bhakti to Bhagavan. So when someone is in trouble, they seek help. This is not a surprise. This is not hard to understand. When one is hungry, one seeks food. When one is cold, one seeks shelter, etc. So, in that seeking, however, the distinction that he's making is that someone might simply be suffering, simply be scared or in distress, and trying to get out of that. Whereas another may have a specific goal of bhakti, and for the sake of fulfilling that goal, take shelter in Bhagavan. So the act of taking shelter may appear identical externally, but what's motivating it is different. Someone may, take shelter in Bhagavan to alleviate their suffering, or even to, achieve some goal that they would like. I remember once in my in my early days on the street with some books in my hand, I met a young lad who was telling me how he used to believe in God, but he gave up on that. And I said, well, what happened? And he said, well, I fell in love, and I had this girlfriend, but she was real Christian, and her father wouldn't let her go out with me unless I became a Christian. So I thought, okay, I'll become a Christian. So I started going to the church, I started participating in the prayers, and they were telling me that if you have faith and you give thanks and you participate in all these things, then God will fulfill your desires and you'll have a happy life. And I thought, it's true. I desire this girl and he's allowing me to have her. So yes, I believe I'll go along with it, etc. So I was happily going on and time went by. But then after a while, she broke up with me and she dumped me. And then I thought, there's no God. He didn't fulfill my desires. This is all nonsense. So I don't believe in God anymore. This was, some 18-year-old kid I met one day. So I offered him a few thoughts on his experience at that time. But I just give this as an example, hopefully maybe a little humorous, to say that someone's quote-unquote taking shelter in God or praying to God can be entirely selfishly motivated, or not really about actually pleasing God or doing what is satisfying to God, or even upholding a commandment that God gives you or anything like this, but entirely self-interested. So here Jiva Gosvami is making a distinction between people who are approaching Bhagavan just to get out of their suffering, and people who are approaching him for the sake of getting into connection with him specifically, or into the path of bhakti, which essentially means to attune to his desires and act in accord with them and enter into loving relationship with him. So the shelter can be self-interested or Bhagavat-interested, or Bhagavat-centric, if you will. So Jiva Gosvami is giving the second category as called Bhakti Matra Kama, or those whose only motive is bhakti. So when here Mahaprabhu is saying Akinchana hoya laho Krishnaika sharan, then we can understand that this is primarily what he means. Means don't come to Krishna, don't take shelter in Krishna because you want him to give you this and give you that in the world, or you want whatever selfish interests you have. But come to him desiring only him. Come to him desiring only bhakti to him. This will be the primary overall import of the payar. And then the specifics that can fall into, refined understanding of what that means are drawn out in all these commentaries that we cited earlier. Because if indeed you are taking shelter in him with the desire only of bhakti, then as a consequence or in the wake of that, then these other notions that one will let go of possessions that aren't favorable to that one will not foster conceit in things unrelated to that one won't remain attached to relationships that don't fulfill that, etc., etc. This will all, follow, if you will. So in that way, we can understand Mahaprabhu's teaching. So to leave asatsanga, to leave even the life of virtue, the life of the responsibilities that one has otherwise, and being divested, meaning desiring bhakti specifically, take shelter in Krishna alone, meaning not a bit of shelter here and a bit of shelter there, but take shelter in Krishna and not anywhere else. So this is the teaching. So now, to give evidence of this, he cites the conclusion of the instructions in the Gita. Sriman Mahaprabhu further discusses these two categories of persons who take shelter in Sri Bhagavan ahead in verse 99 of this chapter. To evidence the instruction in the pyre under discussion, and clarify what taking shelter solely in Krishna entails, Sriman Mahaprabhu cites the conclusion of Bhagavan Sri Krishna's most confidential of all instructions in Srimad Bhagavad Gita, having cited the two instructions he gives therein preceding this one, earlier in verses 57 and 58 of this chapter. So there we looked at this progression of, as Jiva Gosvami gives it, as teaching about Brahman as being confidential knowledge, teaching of Paramatma as more confidential knowledge, teaching of Bhagavan as most confidential knowledge, and then this one-pointed taking shelter in Bhagavan as the most confidential of all, or this way he gives the gradation in the way it's thought. So these are points we discussed earlier. So we'll look here at how various acaryas of our sampradaya have commented on this verse of the Gita. So, Sarva dharman parityaja mamekam sharanam vraja aham tvam sarva papebhyo mokshayashyami ma shucha. Completely relinquishing all dharmas, take shelter solely in me. I will free you from all sins, do not grieve. So, I have here to begin the commentary that Sanatana Gosvami himself gives in the Prakaran on Sharanagati in Hari Bhakti Vilas, and that we studied recently in our discussion of that Prakaran, so I'm not going to reread that. But for reference, that's where we can start the discussion. But interestingly, he gives an additional commentary on this verse in another place in Hari Bhakti Vilas. So I'll pick up from that point. In this initial commentary, the point is just reiterated that this is the most confidential of all the teachings, and the general import of the verse is stated. So he adds to that as follows. Sarvan nityanamikari karma lakshanat paritadya sarvata tyaktva mamekam sharanam braja mad eknishto bhavat iti artaha. So completely relinquishing, that is, completely abandoning all dharmas in the form of duties which are compulsory, incidental, or otherwise, take shelter solely in me, that is, be a fixity solely in me. This is the meaning. Yadva sharanagatatva matrenapi mam ekam ashraya kim uta ekantitvena. Alternately, the instruction is, take shelter solely in me just by being a sharanagata, much less by being one-pointed. That is, even if you cannot become one-pointed upon me as I instructed in the previous verse, at least just become a sharanagata of me. So this is interesting. As we discussed in the Prakaran on Sharanagati, this is something that Sanatana Gosvami brings out there, which came at the very beginning of the Prakaran, where he characterizes Sharanagati as something that's easier to do than any other form of bhakti. That as he said, for those who are incapable of hearing, chanting, remembering, worshipping, and all these other practices of bhakti that I've discussed, lastly, I mentioned this, which is accessible for them all, Sharanagati, which he defined, as we discussed, as Kevalam Bhagavadiyoyam Etavat Matram, that just this much, only, I am Bhagavan's, I belong to Bhagavan, I am his or I am yours. One who simply fosters that affirmation within oneself. This is someone practicing the limb of bhakti known as Sharanagati. So this is his alternate interpretation. So as we saw in the previous verse in the Gita, where he says, Man mana bhava mad bhakto, be of mind upon me, be my bhakta, worship me, etc. Then he's saying that take shelter in me alone can mean, now that your mind is upon me, you're engaged in worship of me, you're bowing to me, have fixity, have your shelter as me alone, like a continuation of that line of thought. That's one interpretation. Or the second interpretation is that level of akantita, or one-pointedness of your mind, your actions, your body are all dedicated to him. Maybe someone can't do that or isn't yet at the stage of doing that. So this is like a consolation. If you can't do that, at least do this, which implies it's something easier to do. So this second interpretation parallels the way that he introduces the whole prakaran of Sharanagati in that section elsewhere in Hari Bhakti Vilas, by saying, take shelter solely in me, even, quote, just by being a Sharanagata tva matrena, which implies that that's less than doing so so to speak, on top of that, engaging in varieties of worship or other varieties of ostensible or acute dependence upon me or things like that. Even if you can't act it out in any way, even if you can just hold this conviction in your own heart and mind, whatever it is that you might actually literally do or say, if you can just have this resolve within yourself that I belong to him. Maybe even all your actions don't fully align with that conviction, but what he wants to say here is nevertheless holding that conviction and aspiring to bring one's actions and speech in alignment with it is itself one way of understanding this form of bhakti known as Sharanagati. So, in this way, two interpretations are offered. And interestingly, he's prefacing this by saying this is, quote, the most confidential knowledge, so that even that accessibility can be considered an essentiality of confidentiality, if I may. In other words, that Bhagavan is so accommodating and so, broad in his dispensation that someone that can just hold this resolve within themselves, that is enough for him to take such, action in their interest. Okay, so we'll look at the rest of the tika. But lastly, I'll just say, much less by being one-pointed, another sense that this can also convey can also convey the sense that Bhagavan is saying, just do this much, and of course do more. in other words, it's like, do this, and all the more that you can manage. It can also, be seen to convey that import as well. Okay. Nanu, vihita akaranena papam syat. So a doubt is raised, well, sin shall occur because of non-performance of what has been enjoined. So this is Arjun's doubt. If Krishna says, okay, leave all this varnashram dharma, leave all these other responsibilities, just take shelter in me. Then he says, but won't I be culpable of sin because I neglected those responsibilities? Tatraha sarvebhyo bihita akarane jebhya katanchit nisheda acharane jebhya cha tata sangsar dukkha karana karma rupebhya tad vasanadi rupebhyo pi papebhyo mokshayashyami iti. Ata ma shucha papa bhaina bhishma dronani vadhena va shokam ma kuru. So he says, to that, I will free you from all sins, those produced by non-performance of what has been enjoined, those produced by performance of what has been forbidden, those in the form of acts that are causes of suffering in samsara, and those in the form of the inclinations and so forth related to those, that is, to those acts that that are causes of suffering in samsara. So this is an interesting point, or this is a point that he brings out here, which we don't see in many other commentaries, is that by including this mention of vasanas, what we can gather is that he wants to say that Sharanagati itself is sufficient to effect chitta shuddhi. So it's one thing to purify someone of sin, but the tendency to sin, the vasana for sin, nevertheless remains. This is a topic taken up in the 6th canto, for example, and what makes the path of bhakti different from forms of prayaschita, or forms of atonement that are sometimes prescribed on the karma marg, and which may involve worship of Vishnu or other forms of Bhagavan. So someone might perform some act of bhakti as a means of prayaschita or atonement, and that may result in the nullification of some consequences due to them for a sinful act that they performed in the past. But that won't result in the purification of the tendency within them that led them to commit that sin, or free them from other proclivities that may leave them prone to committing sin in the future. But what's so wonderful about bhakti is that it both purifies one of the consequences of past sins and also reattunes the psyche such that the vasanas that lead to one committing sin are also purged from the psyche, and the bhakti vasana is entrenched or ingrained into the psyche, which is, the purest of pure things, and certainly never something that will result in the detriment of oneself or anyone else. In other words, sin-proof vasanas are getting instilled into the mind. So here, by saying that Bhagavan is saying, I will free you even from those sins in the form of inclinations, implies that Chitta Shuddhi ultimately is affected by the Sarup Shakti's agency over the psyche and its components of elements of the Bahiranga Shakti, and that just the act of Sharanagati, conceived here in the just sense of a simple, more accessible means, itself can also lead to such purification of the psyche, as well as, consequences for past actions, or the neglect of certain present actions that would otherwise be compulsory. So this is important in the sense that sometimes a lot of stress is put on Namasankirtan or other means of bhakti, which are championed as means of purifying the psyche. Mahaprabhu himself said, Chaitodarpana Marjanam, as he began to glorify Krishna Sankirtanam, saying that it cleanses the mirror of the mind. So, no doubt it does, and no doubt it's highly praiseworthy, and no doubt we're highly benefited by engaging in that to whatever amount that we're able. So, not to in any way, detract from that, but nevertheless to recognize that it's not Namasankirtan alone that has the power to purify the psyche, but rather all acts of bhakti, and even here the act of Sharanagati, which is conceived to be the most accessible of all things, just fostering this conviction at heart that I am his, that I belong to him, that this itself purifies the psyche. This itself leads to the dissolution of all those entangling vasanas. So this ultimately can lead us to understanding the power and the significance of what we think and what attitudes we foster in and out of the days of our lives, and how these things have, long-term profound significance. So it creates a profound degree of meaning for how we live our inner lives, if you will, or how we, think and foster our own attitudes in the course of our life, to whatever extent that might be observable to our friends and neighbors or not, and that, there can be profound benefit even in something that might be utterly, externally imperceptible or immeasurable to society. So a bhakta might be very deeply steeped in something like this, but it might appear like a regular bhakta, might not even appear to be an expert in variety of bhakti sadhana 1, 2, or 3, or externally be observed to engage in many, long periods of engagement and practice 1, 2, or 3. So these type of comments, they can, allow us to see others in a charitable way and to appreciate whatever extent they may engage in whatever it is that they do. And also foster hope that something like this is something that can be done by anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances. It's not that you need to go to a temple. It's not that you need to even, have a particular space dedicated for this practice and not anything else. This is simply something that one can think in one's mind, wherever one may find oneself. So, this path that we've been given is so flexible and capable of being practiced in, all human circumstances in one shape or form. So we may be fond of particular practices of bhakti, and it's perfectly fine to be fond of them or to prefer to engage in some more than others, but sometimes that fondness can lead to a lack of understanding of how other forms of bhakti can be performed in other aspects of our lives. So in that way, this point also helps to grasp the pervasiveness of the path and its accessibility. Okay, without excessively elaborating. So those are Sanatana Pad's points in this regard. So now we'll look at some points that Jiva Gosvami makes. Sri Jiva Pad offers two subtle clarifications of the meaning of this verse in reference to its citation in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Sri Rupa Pad cites this verse as one of a number of evidences for the conclusion established immediately following the section in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu on the subject of eligibility for Uttama Bhakti. That, for those who are bearers of eligibility for the path of Uttama Bhakti, no fault arises because of non-execution of karmas, that is, non-observance of the dharmas of one's varna and ashram, and rather for bearers of eligibility for the path of Uttama Bhakti, fault arises because of non-performance of limbs of bhakti. So this is something we discussed earlier. When you have shraddha in a path, then it's compulsory to act according to that path, and it's a fault and you're held accountable for neglecting to do that. So if you have shraddha in karma, then it's considered a sin or a detriment to neglect to follow the path of karma. But if you have shraddha in bhakti, then it's considered a fault to neglect to engage in bhakti, even if you're neglecting in it to go and engage in karma. Because if you actually have faith in bhakti, then you don't have any business going back to that act of karma. So this is all points we've made before, but this point that Jiva Gosvami brings out, Chakravarti Pad reiterates it, is also quite interesting. So he says, Sarva dharman parityaja iti parishabda sarupatopi tyagam bodhayati. Sarva papebhya sarva antarebhya iti eva artaha. Shri Bhagavad Agyaya Bhakto Shraddhavatam Karma Tyage Pap Anupapate. Interesting. He says, in this phrase, quote, completely relinquishing all dharmas, the prefix pari refers to abandonment even in actual form. That is literally not performing the actions, rather than just abandoning attachment to the actions while continuing to perform them. So, what he's saying is that Krishna says parityajya rather than just tyajya. So if he said tyajya, give it up, it might mean, okay, do it, but don't be attached. But if he's saying parityajya, then it can mean literally give up the act itself. So if you literally give up the act, then as was raised in the doubt in the previous commentary, well then will I be guilty of the sin that comes from doing that? Since to literally neglect to not engage in that action is considered a sin on the path of karma. So he says, quote, from all sins means from all impediments. Because of the non-occurrence of sins, as a result of abandoning duties or karma for one possessed of Shraddha in bhakti on the order of Sri Bhagavan. So this is interesting because as it's the point being made here is that if you read this verse as being applicable to a karma adhikari, then there would be the worry that they would be committing sin and need to be freed from sin because they're neglecting to perform their karma, meaning their varnashram dharma, and it's a sin not to do that. But if you read this verse in the context of a bhakti adhikari, someone who has eligibility for bhakti, that means they don't have eligibility for karma. That means they have Shraddha in the order of Bhagavan to not engage in karma and instead engage in bhakti. So if someone has that Shraddha and acts in accord with that action, then there is no sin that will come to them. So why would Bhagavan say, okay, I'll free you from all sins? If Bhagavan meant sin, when he's talking to a bhakti adhikari, his own statement would imply that taking shelter in him would still leave you culpable for sin. But Jiva Gosvami is reading it that couldn't be Bhagavan's intention, because Bhagavan doesn't even want you to even think that neglecting, once you've acquired Shraddha in him, once you're acting in accord with his directives for you, that there would be any scope for any sin arising at all. So then, if you say, okay, then that's what Bhagavan means. Then when he says sarva dharman when he says sarva papebhyo, that I'll free you from all these sins, then what does he mean? If he himself isn't implying that you would be guilty or you would be held accountable for sin because of the act of taking shelter in him and neglecting of your varnashram dharma. So therefore Jiva Gosvami says all impediments, or he takes pop here, someone might, critically argue that it's a stretch, but to me it's a profound subtlety that he's bringing out by saying we shouldn't interpret the word pop here in the conventional sense. We should interpret the word pop, or quote sin, as rather impediments, as rather things that are obstructive for one on the path of bhakti. So then the import of what Krishna is saying isn't about sin at all. It's saying that adhering to these other activities in lieu of engaging in bhakti, that's an opportunity law. There's an opportunity cost for that. In other words, you're losing time, energy, investment that you could have put into bhakti by putting it into that. So leave that, take shelter in me, and by doing so, I will assist in ensuring that no impediments will remain for you. In other words, that the attachment that might be there, the samskara for those things that might be there in the mind, I'll purify your mind of that, or I'll, arrange the social circumstances to minimize your entanglement in that. So Jiva Gosvami is saying that we need not even consider that there's any concern about sin at all here. Rather, it's just an assurance to Arjuna that by taking shelter in Krishna, that Krishna will look after everything that's required for him as his bhakta. So this is a rather rare interpretation. I haven't seen anyone else bring this point out. So this is found in the Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu. So from here, we'll also look at Chakravarti Pad's commentary. He has quite a bit to say on this verse, and also some of Baladeva Dibhushan that adds to that. So I think we'll dive into that in the next class. So here we are. We've entered the Sharanagati Prakaran, and there are many very nice points to draw out and appreciate and contemplate, and ideally, that they may find application in our life. So we'll continue with this in the coming discussions. So I'll conclude here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, feedback of any other type, please feel free. Yes, I see a raised hand.
Pranam Baba.
Pranam.
I have a question. For example, in the situation when the bhakti practitioner is trying to take shelter in Bhagavan by only wishing for bhakti and not for anything else, it seems to be easier when someone is not actually experiencing severe suffering. But for example, in another situation when also a person is trying to take shelter in Bhagavan by only wanting bhakti, but is actually experiencing very severe suffering in real life, like let's say chronic pain or something which is very experiential and very difficult to go through, it seems to be very difficult not to wish for the suffering to stop in this situation, because it's the most natural desire when someone, for example, in pain, it's to wish for the suffering to stop. So my question is how to transcend this pain, for example, or the suffering, in order to not to wish for it to stop, when we already, for example, received this knowledge that we shouldn't be wishing for anything else but bhakti. How to, because it seems to be very difficult, when the person finds himself in severe pain, how not to wish for it to stop. It's
So suppose someone is in that case and they're feeling pain and they're wanting it to stop, some bhakta, okay? Then if you ask that bhakta, why do you want this suffering to stop? Then what will they say? I'm asking.
If it's severe pain, just not to feel pain, because it's very difficult to feel the pain, because they don't want to feel the pain.
Really? You don't think that bhakta would say, I'd like to be relieved of this pain so that I can engage in some bhakti?
Of course, sure.
Okay, so in that context, the person's fundamental desire is engaging in bhakti, and their tangential or their circumstantial desire is to be relieved of the thing that's stopping them from engaging in bhakti. Right?
Yes.
Okay, so that's not off the table, or that's not out of the ballpark. In other words, when Jiva Gosvami is discussing these points, and he's, there's, as we discussed also in the Sharanagati Prakaran, that to seek to have a resolve to do the favorable, to reject the unfavorable, to want, to reject the unfavorable requires also desiring to not be subject to the unfavorable. And the unfavorable isn't just attachments we might have or wrong behaviors that we may engage in. Unfavorable things can also be circumstances or bodily conditions that restrict us from engaging in bhakti. So, on the strength of one's desire for bhakti, on the strength of one's desirousness of Bhagavan, to circumstantially have a desire to be relieved from an obstacle to that is part of the process of desiring bhakti. Just as we might desire to be freed from some habit that takes up our time and detracts us from engaging in bhakti, to be freed from that habit, why do we want to be free from that habit? So that we have more time and that we can be more absorbed in bhakti. So similarly, if someone says, I have this disease which is causing me such pain that I can't be absorbed in bhakti, then in one sense, there's no difference than wanting to be freed from the habit as there is wanting to be freed from the disease. So what's most essential is the principal alignment, the principal depth of that raw desire for bhakti. Because it is also possible to say, oh yes, if I want to be free from this just for the sake of bhakti. And then as soon as you're free from it, then you don't go, then you don't actually use your time to engage in bhakti. There can be some rationalization, if you will, things like this. But there are also cases where people, there was that story of this, I think it was a Frenchman, if I'm not mistaken, someone in World War II who was in a plane, about to crash in a plane, and prayed to God, if I'm saved from this, I promise I'll dedicate the rest of my life to you. And then it was saved, and then he went to India and became a Vaishnava and lived, the rest of his life in a devout manner, so to speak. I mean, I don't know the details of the story, but something like this. So I just mentioned this example to say that the person had this desire to be saved from dying in the plane crash, but they wanted to live because they wanted to live for him. And then they actually did that. So in that case, that's something honorable. That's something favorable for a bhakta sadhaka. So when, all this teaching, all this siddhanta, all these, leelas, all these tattvas, all these things, what is it all about? It's about bolstering the strength of our desire for bhakti, bolstering the strength of our desire for Bhagavan. Bhava bhakti itself is the principal characteristic of it is desirousness of Bhagavan alone. So whatever we can do, however we can act, however we may pray, in a way that strengthens and deepens that fundamental orientation, that's legit, that's congruent, if you will. And, at the same time, someone can have a degree of detachment and say, if somehow it's bhakti to you, or it's more pleasing for me to remain in this condition that I'm in now, I also accept that. If you want to play the devil's advocate, so to speak, if someone can say, I want to do bhakti to you, I want to do what is pleasing to you, and I want what is favorable to that. And then if they remain in that suffering condition, they can also see it that way. So ultimately it's how someone looks at it. But the main point I'm making is that for someone to have and feel some degree of desire to be freed from acute suffering for the sake of being able to further engage themselves in the path of bhakti, that wouldn't disqualify them, in my view, from being what Jiva Gosvami here is classifying as a person who's, quote, bhakti matra kama, or whose desire is only bhakti. Visvanatha Cakravarti, in his tika on the definition of uttama bhakti, he also gives the example of someone who suddenly goes into an accident or a near-death experience and then calls out the name of Bhagavan in fear. And they might have been calling that person out and having had a desire that Bhagavan save them from that danger. And he says that is a fleeting desire, but he says that Uttama Bhakti is not free from those fleeting desires. It's free from desirousness. It's abhilashita, not abhilash. That is what Uttama Bhakti is free from. So in other words, he doesn't consider it off the table, or he doesn't consider it impossible that in a moment of an accident or a dangerous situation, or in passing, some desire to be freed from danger disqualifies someone from having what is called Uttama Bhakti. But rather it's the desirousness, or the abhilashita, means what is the principal thing that's being cultivated? What is the overarching or the predominant element? That's more significant than what might arise and then disperse according to an acute circumstance. So, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. Only one more little question left. Let's say this person who was experiencing severe suffering and wishing to take shelter in Bhagavan by only wanting bhakti, succeeded, and Bhagavan granted his shelter and gave bhakti to this person. Is it possible to experience simultaneously bhakti and continue to experience suffering, or the nature of bhakti is such that the suffering will be cancelled out like immediately if like the Bhagavan really grants the shelter to someone? Is it possible to experience this granting of shelter and bhakti and still feel any sort of suffering, or the person loses like any connection to any ability to feel suffering?
It's possible, it depends. We hear in the Bhagavatamrita discussion of this, also in the commentaries on Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu, that bhakti has the power to remove all suffering from someone. It's called kleshagni. It has this characteristic of being a destroyer of suffering. This is general. But bhaktas don't perform bhakti purely for the sake of freeing themselves from suffering. They perform bhakti for the sake of bhakti, for the sake of serving Bhagavan. So there's an instance where Sanatana Gosvami, he says that there are some cases where Bhagavan wants to remove a bhakta's suffering. He wants them to have the ability to engage in service to him in a particular way for his pleasure, so he wipes that out. In other cases, he may not feel the need to wipe that out, and it's actually the bhakta's prerogative. In other words, a bhakta may elect to have his prarabdha karma cancelled so that he can further engage in some form of bhakti he so desires, or he may opt to allow it to run its course. So, for persons who get to that, high-level stature, if you will, then we hear that it doesn't always happen in the exact same way. In some cases, Bhagavan has a purpose for them to fulfill in the world, so they remain in the world and they may suffer in the course of that. And they accept that because they understand that that's how they can serve Bhagavan. Dhruva, Prahlad, others who, after having had darshan of Bhagavan, after having been blessed with bhakti by Bhagavan, remained in the world, continued to perform worldly responsibilities, still underwent varieties of hardships. That doesn't prove that bhakti doesn't remove suffering. It proves that they were so filled with bhakti, they were ready to take on suffering, and they weren't engaging in bhakti merely for it to destroy suffering. But there are other cases where it doesn't work out like that. There isn't some role that person needs to play, so to speak, so Bhagavan may quickly bring that person to him. Or he may leave it up to them, and they may have the elective to pursue it one way or pursue the other. These are ways that Sanatana Gosvami has dealt with this. So, in short, there's no one fixed way that it unfolds.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, well, I think we can conclude here for the evening. So if we're so blessed, we'll continue next week and we'll look further at the commentaries here on the celebrated concluding instruction of Srimad Bhagavad Gita. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Radhe Shyam, thank you.